The Charlotte Ledger Podcast is a member of the Queen City Podcast Network.
This episode of the Charlotte Ledger Podcast is presented by Childcare Search. Does your search for childcare have you stressed out? There's a lot to consider, like quality, price, location, schedule, and more. At Childcare Search, a service of Childcare Resources, Inc., our knowledgeable navigators can help you find licensed care that fits your family's needs. Visit www.findchildcarenc.org or call 1-888-600-1685 for free personalized guidance.
Welcome to the Charlotte Ledger Podcast. I'm Steve Dunn. To find out more about the Charlotte Ledger, visit thecharlotteledger.com. I'm joined today by Michael Graff, founder of the Charlotte Optimist, a nonprofit media outlet that sends an email newsletter every Sunday night. Welcome, Michael.
Thanks for having me.
Glad to have you here. Tell us about the Charlotte Optimist. What do you do?
Well, we launched it in May of 2025, and what we do is we sort of tell largely long-form stories every Sunday night about the people and places in our city and issues affecting it. Sometimes they're essays, sometimes they're more column-y, and a lot of times they're profiles. And the whole idea is to give people a deeper understanding of the people who make decisions here and other people doing good work in their community.
Well, you're a nonprofit. I'm sure you're happy to accept donations if people want to make them, but it's a free product, right? You can sign up for free at charlotteoptimist.com.
That's right. Yep. This is sort of my dream of coming back to Charlotte. I was working at Axios for a long time, and I was in management there and oversaw their entire southern bureau, and was traveling to Richmond and Northwest Arkansas and New Orleans, and I have two little boys. They're 6 and 3, and I just kind of wanted to come back and do something in Charlotte and try to make a difference here for them.
Welcome back.
Thank you.
And I are talking today because we both read a book by Robert FitzPatrick called Charlotte, Searching for Soul in a Booming Southern City. And you wrote an article for The Optimist and sent that out. I, as a subscriber, received it and read it. And I read it with great interest because I had recently had Robert on the podcast to talk about the book. And so I was interested in your reaction to it. And I thought that, you talked to Robert, I talked to Robert, maybe I should talk to you and you should talk to me. And then we could kind of close the loop in that way. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about the book, but a lot about Charlotte, because we're both people who were not born and raised in Charlotte, but have lived here for a while. And I think we're both people who think about Charlotte. And we've both had this recent experience of talking to Robert about his book. So I thought where I'd start is about our own history. Like many people in Charlotte, we both moved here from somewhere else. I moved here in 1986 when I was 13 years old. My father retired from the Air Force and moved us here. And I went to Quail Hollow Junior High, and then I went to South Mech. And then after graduating from high school, I went to college and law school and moved back to Charlotte in the late 90s. And in 1999, bought a house in Plaza Midwood and still live there to this day. So I consider myself a Charlotte guy. I don't get credit for being born here, but I've lived here a lot longer than anywhere else. And I'm very much a Plaza Midwood guy. And so I've seen Charlotte go through a lot. What's your history with this town?
Yeah, I moved here in 2013 to be the editor of Charlotte Magazine at the time. I had worked at Our State Magazine before that and had lived all over North Carolina. I'm originally from Maryland and grew up in sort of the shadow of D.C. and Baltimore. But in my early newspaper career, I was living in small towns from Winchester, Virginia, to Rocky Mount, to Fayetteville, North Carolina, during the heart of the Iraq War and Afghanistan War, and eventually landed at Our State in Greensboro. I've lived in Greensboro and Winston-Salem, and I would come to Charlotte and always sort of admired the sort of cosmopolitan nature of the city. Actually, of course, I'm from a smaller town, and I'm from an area with two different cities that. Washington has its own identity. Baltimore has a much more interesting identity. And when I got to Charlotte, for some reason, it was the biggest city I'd ever directly lived in. And so I was just sort of amazed at how quickly I fell in love with it and how easy it was to really tap into the people who were making things happen here. Of course, I was the editor of the magazine, so it was nice that I had a little bit of an easier time opening doors because people wanted to tell me things. But it was pretty quick that I learned, oh, wow, I could talk to the people who make a difference here pretty quickly. I've only been here 2 years, 3 years, and then next thing I know, it's been 13 years, and I know a lot about this city. I know about its history. Since I left Axios in March of 2025, 2 months before we launched The Optimist, I would guess I've had 500 coffee conversations or lunches or things like that in the year plus that I've been doing this. Stack them up on Mondays, Tuesdays, and Wednesdays, and all we do is talk about Charlotte.
It's amazing to hear your perspective on first impressions of the city as an adult newcomer.
Yeah.
I hadn't thought in a long time, and I didn't even think in preparation for today about my own first impressions, but I'm thinking about it now. And I was a kid. I was 13, and I moved, and I was a military kid. So we had lived in a bunch of different places. I was born in Texas. I've lived in several cities. There was a space of 6 years where I went to a different school every year. And as I think of it now, my first impressions as a kid were, number one, this was a much more racially diverse place than I had come from. I moved here from Colorado, and the place that I lived before that was Rhode Island. And neither one of those was diverse to remotely the same extent that Charlotte is. And I remember being struck. I moved to Charlotte in the summertime, and we were in the throes of a drought. We have droughts here every few years that go on for a few months, right? And this was like the worst drought that anybody had ever experienced. And so as the realtor was driving us around and everybody was talking about how it hadn't rained and how dry it was, but I couldn't believe how green it was and how many trees there were. Again, coming from Colorado, which is a very much drier sort of environment, I felt like it was very humid. But then the next things that I noticed that really stood out to me were NASCAR racing, which I had never seen before, and I could not understand cars just driving around. Like at the time, I called it driving around in a circle. I've learned more since then. But the other thing that really blew my mind was ACC basketball at that time in the 80s, and how I think there were only 8 teams in the ACC at that time, and the Friday of the ACC tournament was almost like a school holiday, by which I mean we watched the ACC tournament on TV all day at school rather than having school. And I just thought that was the coolest thing in the world. And that's how I learned about Carolina, and that's how I learned about Duke and all these things that I never really had heard of before. But those were my first impressions. I wasn't thinking about it in terms of like career prospects or, how does the government work or, anything like that. It was a very, very childlike, sort of approach. And it was kind of negative, frankly, because I was a kid. I liked Colorado and I liked it, so I never liked moving. And so I was angry about having to be here. But you eventually have grown to love the city. But as you and I have discussed in preparing for today, I find it hard to articulate really clearly why I love Charlotte or what Charlotte even is. And I thought what we could do is use Robert's book as kind of a starting point for this conversation. And I will tell you that I really enjoyed meeting him and talking with him. But one thing that surprised me about my conversation with them is that he did not perceive his take on Charlotte as being negative, while I did. I thought, as I read his book, that it was explicitly critique, and in many ways a harsh critique of Charlotte. But he doesn't see it that way. I think that he thinks that he's just kind of telling it like it is. And but he has a very particular view, and it challenged me in certain respects because there were some things I didn't agree with. There were some things I did agree with. There are some aspects of Charlotte that I'm not crazy about, and he focuses on them like a laser. But overall, what I took away from the book was that he views the commerce and business and development and growth and money, above all, as being the thing that sets the course of Charlotte's direction and that dominates the discourse, and that it is, he does not use the phrase soulless. He does not describe Charlotte as soulless, but I've heard others describe Charlotte as a soulless town. It's kind of a blank canvas, a bland, benign sort of place. And so I wonder, what's your reaction to the book and what's your take in general?
Yeah, I actually listened to your podcast, your conversation with him while I read it about the same time I had opened it for the first time. And then, the first 6 or 7 chapters were pretty negative. And I was like, I don't know if I want to keep going with this, honestly. I was like, I don't think let's say he was coming across as sort of swatting at demons of Charlotte that I didn't know existed I don't think exist anymore. Some of them. But then around, I think I mentioned in my story, chapter 8, when I picked it back up, I didn't stop reading it after I picked it up from there because I was learning things from it. I was learning about activism in North Charlotte in 1970. I was learning things about his shoes on the ground, shoe leather work in the 70s and 80s, and I really enjoyed that. I like learning. I like lighting up, and those chapters made me say, "Oh, I got something from this." I really enjoyed that. So with such mixed emotions to two parts of the book, I sent him an email the next morning and said, "Let's please talk." And he was happy to get on the phone. And I really thought it would be a 30-minute call. And we wound up talking for 2 hours, 2 hours and 15 minutes, I think I look back at the phone call. I really enjoyed talking to him. And he doesn't think it's negative. And he's very objective when you talk to him about it, and he gives grace to the same characters that he, I won't say trashed in the book, but I guess took shots at in the book.
There's some villains.
Yeah, there are some villains, and he gives a lot of grace to them on the phone, and I thought that was interesting too. And so, now that we've talked about it, I don't know if, as he's gone around and talked about it, I guess that would be a question for him. Maybe he has had an awakening of some sorts to some of the parts of the book that he didn't like quite, and that happens to me all the time. I publish something and I'm like, damn, I wish I'd have twisted this back. I wish I'd have done more in this chapter, or I wish I'd have called another person or something like that. But I think he's written something that deserves to be on a library shelf, and I think it deserves to be read by people who care about this city because it's an important perspective.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think you and I are both people who care about Charlotte, and here we are. We set up a meeting to talk about this book. So yes, it obviously is doing and has done something. My reaction to the beginning of it, I think, was similar to yours. I felt as though it was just one example after another of ways in which Charlotte is not great, and some of it almost verged on gratuitous, like beyond the thesis. For example, he goes on at length about the public art in Charlotte, about the spinning disc at the intersection of Trade and Tryon, and about the 4 columns at the intersection of Trade and Tryon, about the frescoes in the lobby of the Bank of America building, and it's like an artistic critique of the artistic merit of these works of art that seemed, in this way and in many other ways, I found myself generally agreeing, I don't think he's wrong about any of that stuff. I personally, just as an example, I don't really hate the frescoes and I really don't hate the spinning disc, but I do find those 4 columns at Trade and Tryon it's not great art in my view. But but why? I didn't know that it was necessary to sort of go there. And I think the risk of that sort of approach is that the reader might conclude that you're just hating, that you're just a hater. But when you talk to him, he's not a hater at all.
Mm-hmm.
I get the impression that he loves Charlotte and he wants nothing but good things for Charlotte. And he definitely fondly remembers a time in which he thought that Charlotte had more spirit or soul, if you will.
Yeah, and I think that is probably consistent with a lot of people who grew up here in the 60s and 70s. I mean, Charlotte jumped from a town of, I think, 200,000 people in 1960 to whatever it is today, over 1 million or so. That's a lot, and it's a lot of change. I mentioned to him in our conversation, my hometown has changed. Areas where I grew up have changed quite a bit. And he was like, that's really interesting. And we talked about it for a little bit. He goes, but that's not the point of the book. I'm not afraid of change. And I don't know Yeah, I'm not here to disagree or agree with him on that. Like, I think he genuinely is interested in Charlotte, and that's why he set out to write a book about it. And like, that's
Well,
a fascinating thing. But he's genuinely interested, but it caused him to move away. So it's almost like there's this, I don't know, he's really interested in it from afar, which is not, doesn't make him different from other people who live away from Charlotte in some ways in North Carolina too.
There absolutely is something about the time in which a city comes into its own that is reflected in the identity of the city itself.
Right.
And so one of the things that a lot of people in observing Charlotte point to is the lack of an overriding cultural spirit, an overriding cultural force that we all relate to in some way. Robert might suggest that it's banking culture and business and money making. I see that as more of sort of the substrate or the canvas. Like I see that as as actually a good thing, like something that provides funding for all of the things that we're up to. But I've been pondering whether, I think there's a lot of truth to that. And I'm wondering if that's because Charlotte became Charlotte in an age in which culture was becoming decentralized as a result of technology, right? I think back to my own childhood when there were 3 television networks and there was something called the Top 40 on the radio. And now there is no Top 40. It's absurd to even think there might be a Top 40,000 because everybody gets whatever they want technologically, right? And the same is true with respect to tech. We don't have the same shared culture in a way as a result of technological development. So I don't know. That's what I've been kicking around in my own brain lately. But
it's smart. I think it's a wise assessment. It's interesting. I don't know. You know, my favorite city outside of Charlotte is Baltimore. I'm from Maryland. The Orioles are on now. I was checking my phone for opening day scores when we first got on. I love the city. People will never question whether that city has a soul. It's kind of a rocky soul, even though it's not Philadelphia. It punches. But let me tell you, a place you'd rather live. Baltimore's got its problems, and they've been well documented over time. And a lot of that goes back to, you know, it is a very old town, and it is, you know, it was huge because it's on the Chesapeake, and it was a huge deal in the late 1700s and in the colonial period. And Charlotte's explosion happened at a time when, I guess, you probably think about it, like, who was it that sang the I'm So Sexy song? Or
so Right Said Fred.
Yeah, Right Said Fred was like exploding. All these things were happening at the same time. Look at it. It's funny. You mentioned the top 40s. I wonder if you could draw a parallel to the kind of music that was exploding and at the top of the top 40 charts in the late 80s and early 90s as Charlotte started to explode, and see any parallels.
We'll be right back to the conversation. This episode of the Charlotte Ledger podcast is presented by Child Care Search, helping families navigate childcare with confidence.
Well, I think economically, another thing that's been happening since the 80s is financialization and sort of the creation and the trading of ever more creative and esoteric financial products. And that has been part and parcel of Charlotte's prosperity. This is a town that is one of the major banking cities, certainly of the United States and also the world, like way above. The amount of money sloshing around Charlotte is way more than what you would normally expect from a city in this size. And I think that may also be a consequence of Charlotte, the consolidation of the banks since the 80s and the types of careers that have existed here ever since then. So we are a city that, I'm sensitive though to those who say that it is lacking in the kind of collective identity that exists in an older city. So for example, I've just recently traveled to Savannah and Charleston, and these are places that have a very distinct identity. And that's not necessarily great because that can be restrictive. That can exclude communities that Charlotte may be able to include very seamlessly. But what it does do, if you're an older city, is it gives the opportunity for certain institutions to be very mature. All right. So for example, you know, some Rockefeller sometime may have set up a foundation or something that is still throwing off a lot of money that is doing good things in cities like that in a way that I think may be lacking in Charlotte compared to some other cities of a similar size.
Yeah, I think of those places as well sometimes. And do you like the night before your birthday or the night before Christmas better than you actually like the day of or the day after when it's over? And to me, Charlotte kind of always feels like Christmas Eve. It's like, we don't know what's coming. There's a lot of stuff under the tree. I don't know. But the excitement is always there because I don't know that we know what Charlotte is yet. And that to me is okay. That's part of why I love it here.
One of the things I think we got to watch out for as people is to take the sort of hater kind of attitude with a certain grain of salt, because I've been in Charlotte a long time. I've heard a lot of people tell me all the things that they don't like about it, how bland they think it is, how soulless they think it is, or whatever. And I've heard all that. And I this is the part I keep wanting to reinforce. I don't necessarily disagree on the merits with anything that they're saying. This is what I've been struggling with in getting ready for this conversation. There is a lack of an overriding sort of cultural framework that we all have to fit into. But I'm just not convinced that that's a bad thing. But the point I'm trying to make now is that these other cities that have that, like Nashville, for example, or Savannah and Charleston, for example, they got haters that live there too.
Right.
This is the whole point. If you study those cities, or if you go to the Reddit communities around those cities, you got people saying the same thing about those places. They're saying it isn't what it once was. We got all these newcomers now. They're building too many apartment buildings or whatever. And so just because people are complaining about a place doesn't necessarily mean anything about that place.
That's fascinating. Yeah, that's true. I've heard it for years too, and I got several emails from people after this, and one of them was really well thought out and thought, what if Charlotte's identity is actually changed, and why isn't that okay? Like, what if we just say that's our identity? And I don't know that we have to name it. I don't know. I could say this in my story where, I think it's okay if Charlotte doesn't meet the expectations of some people who live here, if they have some personal standard for what soul means to them or what a sense of place means to them. To me, it's just a city and it has been always a city of possibilities, a city where we just in the ledger just now, at 1:00 today, I got a news alert about 600 jobs coming to Charlotte. And we've had how many of those in the past week? And I know that it's not setting the world on fire to say we got more jobs coming, but the reality is that directly makes it a more interesting place to live, because those 600 people who are going to come here making an average of $190,000 a year are going to spend money on other things. They're possibly going to not just restaurants, but they might invest in an arts organization. They might do these things. And so you never know what can sprout from a new person coming or a local deciding that they want to lean in a different way.
I like that idea of change being the thing, and maybe that's okay, right? And it may be an environment that we have here where all flowers can bloom and all people doing all kinds of things can proliferate sort of in peace. I don't perceive that we have a lot of social tension in this town in the way that exists in certain other places. Maybe not to the same extent in any of it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there certainly still is, and there's certainly a lot of social tension, but I wouldn't say it reminds me of any other place I've ever been in that way. I mean, there's some here, but we have, the biggest tension I think is between people like me celebrating those 600 jobs and the long timers who come here and don't have the skills to get one of those jobs and wondering where they're going to live. Obviously, I mean, that keeping people who grew up here and were trained for the workforce of the 90s and 2000s, keeping them able to live here is a big challenge, and that's a huge tension. And I think we see a lot of folks moving to Concord and places like that right now because of that. I think if I were to say that one problem with Charlotte's identity right now is that the sort of blue collar middle class, is just, it's non-existent. And I hope not non-existent. It's just harder to be middle class here than anywhere else, than most other places in North Carolina.
I think you make a great point about the passage of time.
Yeah.
We talked about how a lot of Robert FitzPatrick's book harkens back to the 60s and the 70s and the changes that occurred around that time, and his work as a community organizer in Chicago and in Charlotte into the 80s. That's 40 years ago now. And Charlotte's a different city and has been through a lot in a very interesting time, as we just discussed. But what also happens with the passage of time is that our notions of progressivism also change. Robert's book talks about the destruction of the Brooklyn neighborhood and in Second Ward, and I'm making no defense of that. I see Independence Boulevard coming through my neighborhood, and I wonder, gosh, what if they hadn't have done that?
I'm happy that so many people are educated on something like Brooklyn now. I feel like it probably faded away from consciousness.
Yeah, but do you think those people thought they were doing a terrible thing?
No.
And the things that we think we're doing now, we have to, with the passage of time, and you got to be careful here because we're not making any excuses for this. But at the same time, I thought we were doing the right thing in the 90s. I still think we were doing the right thing in the 90s. But reasonable minds can disagree, right? You could look at that now and be very critical of it. I've been in a place where, a lot of the problems in Charlotte are connected with growth and development, but I've seen the problems caused by the lack of growth and development and infrastructure. But there is something about Charlotte that strikes me as really odd in that it's really hard to describe what's special and unique about Charlotte, but it's clear that people love Charlotte. Right? People want to move here. People are moving here. People stay here. And I'm not totally clear why that is. One of the things that I used to say a lot sometimes was that Charlotte's a great place to live, but you wouldn't want to visit here. It doesn't seem like an obvious tourist destination, and it is nevertheless, believe it or not, the biggest tourist town in North Carolina. And I'm not sure what everybody does, but people love living here, and I wonder why you think that is.
That's really funny. There were some lines in the book where he kind of took some swipes at Charlotte's got a lot. And I think it's interesting because, I know a lot of the people who work at the tourism. They're wonderful humans. They have, they try hard, they work hard, they're up all night if something goes wrong at Bojangles Coliseum, And so I think of the people behind those slogans, and I'm like, that wasn't a message for Charlotteans. That was a message for other people to come here. So it doesn't, just because we make fun of it doesn't mean it doesn't work. But why do I think that is? I have an anecdote. This past summer, I guess it's been 8 or 9 months ago now, I went to a family wedding in Ohio. And it was in the middle of Ohio, and an 18-year-old, my cousin's son, was there. And he was about to graduate from high school, and he was going to Wake Forest in the fall. His older brother lives in Charlotte. His older sister lives in New York. And he had, because he was the third child, he was free to partake in the champagne and stuff like that. So he was a little tipsy, but he came up to me and he said, "Where do you live?" And I said, "Charlotte." And he goes, "Oh man, Charlotte's awesome." And I was like, what in the world causes this 18-year-old kid in Ohio to say that? I think it's a range of things, from the ease, it's easy to live here to some degree. I think we who've been here a while now say oh, traffic's gotten worse, but for the most part, it's not Washington, D.C.
No, it's not Atlanta. No, not compared to real traffic problem. Yeah, that is a fact.
And I just think for people like him, I think it's reflected in the fact that he sees a lot of young people here. And the one thing Charlotte has really done well over time, including, from back in the days when Bank of America was exploding, or when North Carolina National Bank was exploding, the leaders of those banks prioritized young people. They wanted young people to be able to live here. They did it with Gen Xers, they did it with millennials, and now they're doing it with Gen Zers. And if you walk the rail trail, as I did a couple of Wednesdays ago at noon, the number of people I saw walking around South End was unfathomable.
You know what? I just saw it. I'm interrupting you because I just saw it for the first time a couple weeks ago. I went for coffee in South End. I don't spend a lot of time in South End. I went there, had coffee. I was blown away by the number of people, young people, just walking around. They obviously live there, work there. That's where the companies are moving their offices now. All of the seemingly most of the new stuff that's happening is happening there. And I saw it myself.
Yeah, I mean, free media idea. Somebody should do a little media product just for South End and for people under 30. I think it's an incredible audience and very captive right now. Of course, I don't. I'm 46, so I don't have as much in common with them. But I'm just impressed whenever I see, because when I first moved here, it was millennials everything, and then Charlotte captured those millennials, and now I see baby strollers everywhere, and then now it is focused still on young workforce. I don't think we say Gen Z is not as much, but we still focus on trying to get a young and diverse workforce here, and as long as those opportunities are here, 22 and 23-year-olds are going to come. And as long as however many thousand of them come every year, a certain number of them are going to stay. And the percentages just play out like that over time. And it's really it's just a constant investment in young people that Charlotte seems to have mastered over other places. I don't know that we will ever get to the bottom of whatever Charlotte's identity is, especially in this era of mass media. I was the editor of Charlotte Magazine in 2015 when a friend of mine, well, now as a friend, when Ted Williams launched the Charlotte Agenda. And I remember reading that and being like, what in the hell is this? Like, it's like there's errors throughout it. Like, some of this isn't even right, and like, I was like, what's going on? And I was really fortunate to have a very smart boss at the time, Richard Thurman, because I think the first or second time I came in and I was like, I don't know what this is, but people are reading it. He was like, don't worry about what it is. Think about what it can be. And I really think that's, to me, what I think of whenever I see anything in Charlotte these days pop up. It's like, don't think about what it is right now, because it could be something bigger one day. And I think maybe that is part of our soul. I just think there's something about Charlotte that when you move here, you decide, I'm gonna plug in. My boss told me that. I had planned to move back to a rural area when I got here, and my publisher at Charlotte Magazine says there's something about Charlotte that wraps some people up, and I'm one of the people that I found that to be true. And
there's a line at the end of your article the most recent issue of the Charlotte Optimist, a weekly newsletter which you can sign up for at charlotteoptimist.com, in which you compared searching for soul, if you will, in Charlotte might be a bit like looking for a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow and failing to notice the beauty of all the colors. And you close with the line, the undefined space is our sanctuary. What do you mean by that?
That I'm comfortable with not knowing. And in fact, not more than comfortable. In fact, I like the idea of not knowing what it is. I like the idea that it can change for me based on who I talk to and what they do and their perspective on the city. And I'm perfectly okay living in a city that isn't defined by honky tonks or what Charleston is, the Charleston's past or places like that. I like it here because of that. I'm excited every day or every week, I guess, to wake up and see what Charlotte's done next. And sometimes it can piss me off, and sometimes it can make you say, what in the world are we doing? But it's still fun to me to wake up and say, and I compared it to a song from the Avett Brothers, it was Me and God, and it was like the song is basically like they can go out and find, God in anything. And that's always been kind of my relationship with faith, not to get too deep, but it's like, I find it in Sunrise on the Chesapeake, or I find it, in Sunrise at the Beach or something like that. And to me, that is the whole point. We have to fight for, I used to tell my team at Axios this when they would come to me with complaints. I would say, okay, what is good? And I would say, be grateful for that. Because if you fight for gratitude every day, it'll prevent you from spiraling. And that's something that I pursue every day, is some kind of gratitude for something that happened in that day. And I don't have to look far for it in Charlotte. I find it 10, 20 times a day.
Michael Graff, the Charlotte Optimist. Thanks for being with me today on the Charlotte Ledger podcast.
Thank you.
That's it for today. Thanks for listening. This episode was produced by Lindsay Banks. You can find out more about the Charlotte Ledger by visiting thecharlotteledger.com.
This episode of the Charlotte Ledger podcast was presented by Child Care Search, providing families with personalized guidance and free referrals for quality child care programs.
QueenCityPodcastNetwork.com.